And one of the most important things for me personally is to try and remove any stigmas associated with being non-religious, because I found that there's quite a lot of stigma involved in that sort of thing still here. That said, I'm pleased to welcome Jacques Rousseau, who's going to be speaking to us this evening about the importance of a secular movement and the values of secularism. Jacques is a lecturer here at UCT, lecturing on critical thinking and ethics. He's the founder and chair of the Free Society Institute of South Africa, which is a South African NGO dedicated to defending free speech and the secular viewpoint against threats presented by religion, bad science, and other forms of irrationality. Jacques also writes a weekly column called The Daily Maverick and is well known for his web blog, Synapses. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Jacques.
That's too dark, isn't it? Can you deal with this? Yeah. Okay. Thank you, that's great. All right, well, thanks very much for inviting me to address you today at the launch of the UCT Student FSI Institute. Some of you may have seen the posters around campus, which I thought were quite cool, apart from that grotesque misspelling. But otherwise, it's a lovely poster because sitting prepared to meet thy God with this big T-Rex with a bionic arm. It's all a little bit ambiguous as to what this poster is. But as I was saying to a friend on Twitter, God has a whole week. I only have like 30 minutes. So it's a little bit unfair, but I'll do the best I can. Having said that, the talk isn't really about God, because that's just one of the less important issues that I think we need to concern ourselves with. Because there are far more pressing problems and far more pressing issues that we could concern ourselves with and spend our time focusing on. So, as I say, welcome to the 18th century. And what I mean here is, if you think back or look back or read back to the 1970s, witch hunts were legally sanctioned, we had witchcraft trials, and of course what counted as evidence for being a witch was quite simply that. So we were living in quite a pre-scientific age. And this encouraged a kind of hyperbole, a kind of hysteria, and there wasn't much critical thinking going on. Now, I think that we are in danger of, in a sense, losing some of the gains that the Enlightenment age gained us over the 18th and 19th and the early 20th century. Because things like Twitter and our ever-decreasing attention span are leading to an increasing hyperbole, an increasing escalation of caricature and ridicule and a lack of critical thought. I think people are more interested in putting a line in the sand, and drawing a line in the sand, and asserting some sort of claim to a piece of, in a sense, internet real estate, than in finding some kind of agreement and incorporating to resolve problems. So to deal with some of those cliches right up front, atheists, as I imagine most of you are, if you are anti-atheism or pro-theism, then atheists are hateful. We might think of them as reasonable. They are stubborn, or we might say that they're principled, that they stick to the evidence, and other people call us stubborn. They're blasphemous, or rather you'd say, well, I'm just consistent, because anything that doesn't exist, I'll be equally disrespectful towards it. Blasphemy is not a special category of any kind of disrespect. Or we're immoral or amoral, or I might want to say that we're reliably virtuous in the sense that my decisions as to what's right and wrong come from the same sort of reasoning process. I might think about utilitarian considerations. I might think about what's most likely to get me thrown in jail, or whatever the case might be, but the point is that I would have a moral framework that justifies my point of view rather than a dogma. So we can play this kind of game of trumps or bingo and try to see who wins, and I think that we're wasting our time really doing And when we think of why a secular society, I think one of our key considerations should be what the point is and how we can get the most bang for our buck, how we can get the most change effected, rather than just how we can make the most noise. So, as you might have heard, that cliche about herding cats, atheists and agnostics and so forth, my claim on the earlier slide was that it's not just any cats we're dealing with, but somewhat of a panicked herd of cats, in the sense that we don't know what to do in this new landscape, where attention economy is a problem for us, where we are forced to cope with a deluge of information and don't have the resources and the patience to deal with it as well as we should. Democracy, I don't think, is scaling very well. I think that when we had a small proportion of vocal people who had access to the internet or who had access to the printing press, going even further back, it was quite easy for the elite amongst us to say, yes, everyone should have a view. But suddenly the town square is overflowing with people who just want to yell at you. Okay? So at some point we start to say, well, look, no, not every voice is equally valuable. You know, some of these voices actually don't convey much value at all, yet at the same time there's the conflicting pressure of not wanting to censor any voices, in case there's something valuable to be said. Our media, I don't think, are sufficiently self-regulating, so we get fed lots of crap all the time. And we are too lazy and perhaps too selfish to do the hard work of figuring out what's true and what's false and what's worth believing ourselves. And this problem just keeps getting worse and will continue to get worse. Okay? As I keep saying in undergrad classes, old scripts used to work very, very well when all you had to fight about was a plot of land in your neighborhood, or a cow, or a sheep, or a pig, or whatever. But as we encounter new people with different sorts of value systems, and different sorts of cultures and traditions and religions and so forth, that kind of bartering or that kind of negotiation keeps breaking down. So you can't take for granted that you speak the same language, you have the same values and all that sort of thing. So in a world of globalization, cooperation, I think, becomes even more important. And communication and cooperation get handicapped easier and easier by provincial stubbornness and by moral absolutism. So I mean by those two things, A, a reluctance to see outside of your own backyard, and B, the idea that things can be known for certain and that I have got some sort of hotline to God and the handle on the truth. So my suggested remedy for this, and this is what I hope a secular society would be concerning itself with, is that we've got to rethink our objectives and rethink how we get to those goals, what our tools are. So separating tools from objectives is the first point. All sorts of poverty, intellectual poverty, material poverty, mean fewer choices. But that I think we can all agree on quite easily. I'm not going to talk about material poverty tonight, but intellectual poverty, a dearth of information, a dearth of choices, makes foolish choices seem reasonable. You don't know the alternatives necessarily, so what you choose seems to you the best of an available set of options. So immediately that should cause us to be a little bit more prudent sometimes about ridiculing people for the choices they were in a sense forced to make. It's sometimes a factor or a feature of circumstance that in a sense was unavoidable for some of us. Skepticism within this historical framework, I want to say, is a tool, not an objective, and that atheism is a product rather than a starting point. And this is, I think, perhaps the key message I want to convey to you today, is these two things. Skepticism as a tool. Tools can be used badly or well. I've become increasingly annoyed by every day or every week a new Facebook group seems to start up, which is going to somehow solve the problem of secularism in South Africa and solve the problem of atheism versus religion. It's going to obliterate religion by itself. But all that Facebook group does is exchange photographs of people and quotes next to them. So and they're usually from the Fucking Love Science group or from some other group, and I don't see how you are adding anything, adding much value. It's to use an impolite term for it, it's a kind of a circle jerk. I mean, it's everybody just, fluffing their own egos and saying, yes, here we all are, we're so damn smart. Yes, it's good for us and for our egos, but it doesn't affect any change, because you're not talking to anybody who can hear that message. And secondly, you're usually doing it in a kind of way that disinclines them to listen to anything you have to say. So strategically, it's just wrong-headed. Like any generation of knowledge, collaboration is by default going to be helpful. Unless people are talking to you, you can't persuade them of anything. So for all the lovely, warm, fuzzy feelings it gives us to say, look, there are 100 people all blaspheming at the same time, think a little bit longer term than that, about what difference that's making. Internally to these various movements, things like hyperskepticism. Hyperskeptics get somehow swallowed into the skeptic movement. So you can suddenly start saying things about JFK's assassination, or about Bigfoot, or about Elvis being alive, or whatever, and somehow the skeptic community has to welcome you because you're a skeptic as well. That's also complete nonsense. Skepticism is a tool, and what it involves is paying attention to the evidence, not just being a conspiracy theorist, right? So let's also internally keep our house in order and in a sense, discourage that sort of thing. Also, this ever-escalating ego battle. Those of you who've spent some time dealing with these sorts of things and researching them on the web and following the battles, I mean, back to things like elevator game before, would know that egos are a big problem. And let's not overblow this problem, though, because any movement, once it reaches the critical sort of mass, is going to develop these schisms. It's going to develop egos and competitions and battles for turf, and we'll sort it out in the long run. It's not, I think, as big a problem as some of us like to present it as. It's a way to manufacture blog hits and conspiracies and controversies. So skepticism is a tool and atheism is a product. Second key point. Many of the people I meet, especially from the younger sector at the university, seem to think that the end of the conversation is I'm an atheist. Look at me, I'm so cool. And you're wrong. You're so damn wrong about your religious beliefs. How can you believe that strange and simple stuff? And that's entirely wrong ahead again. Atheism is the conclusion of an argument. You cast your eye around the world and see all sorts of implausible claims. None of them make any sense. None of them are justified. At the end, you might say, well, because all of these things don't give me any persuasive evidence, and because Occam's razor tells me that it's implausible there's a big sky daddy, I'm going to be an atheist. You don't say, I'm an atheist, therefore I'm going to be obnoxious, or therefore I'm going to tell you that you're wrong, or whatever it might be. You're not doing any thinking there. You're doing as little thinking as the opposition is. Some of us, as I say, we're all atheists. I mean, I'm sure that there's some believers in here. And you're atheists too. I mean, many of you would have heard this line. Dawkins most recently used it. We're all atheists. Some of us just go one God further, right? Okay, so the people who are religious in this room are also atheists when it comes to some other kind of God, when it comes to Allah or Shiva or Krishna or Zoroaster or whatever it might be. Okay, we're the same, except we just go one God further. And a key point is that it doesn't make any difference to our lives. That's the important thing to get across, especially to younger religious believers, is that they think that something's going to happen, that somehow you're going to feel devoid of meaning or whatever it might be. And those of you in the room who don't believe in any stuff would, I'm sure, agree with me that nothing changes. It makes no difference to your life whatsoever, except you get your Sundays off. So you can do more fun stuff. The God hypothesis isn't interesting enough to devote all of this attention to. It really is not. It doesn't. There's things in there, which I'll come back to in a moment, which are interesting. I think there are things about community, there are things about society, there are things about ritual, and the kind of rich texture of life, which are interesting in religion. The question is whether we need religion for them, whether we can get there some other way as well, which I'll come back to in a moment. But it doesn't add any value that can't be purchased in a different way, or I would say more cheaply, especially in the 21st century. If you're looking for value and meaning and significance and all that stuff, you can get it elsewhere now. I don't think you had that option in the 17th, 18th century. So just to wrap up on that atheist conversation, the question of who you are, whether you're an atheist or an agnostic or whatever it might be, it's really not as interesting as some of you think it is. Because it's really just a political matter. It's really about branding. It's really about who you want to ally yourself with and who you don't want to. Because I think that if we were honest and thought about it a bit more carefully, we're all agnostic atheists. I'll come back to this later, but science can't deal with untestable hypotheses, right? And science can't deal with things that you can't test in any kind of way. Now, it's a philosophical consideration as to whether you want to have a negative or a positive attitude towards untestable hypotheses. If you want to say, in general, untestable hypotheses are nonsense, or in general, I'm going to leave space open for them. I'm of the philosophical persuasion that we should leave no room for them, and we should reject untestable hypotheses in general. Okay? But that's not an empirical claim. It's not a scientific claim. That's a philosophical claim. So you and I can agree that there's no evidence for God, yet have entirely different responses to that. Some of us might say, there's no evidence for a God, therefore I'm dogmatically saying God cannot exist. Or you can say, I'm strongly persuaded that it's highly unlikely that God exists, so I may as well just pretend that God does not exist. I may as well just say, assert that God does not exist. And that's what I mean by the agnostic atheist. If you've read The God Delusion, we're talking about somebody who's 6.9 on that Newton scale, okay, where 7 is absolute certainty that there's no God, and 1 is absolute certainty that there is a God. I think all of us can justify a 6.9, but that's still an agnostic atheist. To all intents and purposes, you are an atheist, but you can't be dogmatic about it. Or at least you can't be certain about it, is the word. What's more interesting to me is whether you are anything else that's interesting. Whether you spend your time productively, whether you help us fight pseudoscience, whether you help us stop child rape. Those are the interesting things, not what you believe about deities. Now, to the extent that belief in deities might correlate with child rapes, then of course we might want to attack the source. We might want to say, hold on, the papacy is a bad institution, or the Catholic Church is a bad institution. Or we might want to say that the aspect of the Catholic Church that harbors child molesters is a bad aspect of that church. Okay? There are various fine-grained ways to talk about these things, and we tend to reach for the dumbest and simplest and most convenient answer sometimes. So at UCT, you're competing with, according to Rob, 27 faith-based societies. I haven't checked the facts, so I'll take his word for that. On Earth in general, you're competing with all sorts of things. You're competing with 27 faith-based societies and a whole bunch of others, with Xenu, other religions, and even with Alain de Botton, perhaps. You're competing with a legal framework. I spend quite a lot of time writing letters to schools. There's a very well-written policy on religion education, which restricts what schools can do. They need to be kind of equal opportunity offenders. They've got to teach all religions and teach no religion, etc. But you'll often come across schools who ignore that and teach religion, as in proselytize. Our deference to metaphysics, our language involves dualism, involves souls, involves free will, it involves all sorts of dodgy metaphysics. Okay? So those things also help to buttress religion. And of course our customs, liquor sales and Sundays are one example. And all of these things annoy and frustrate, I know. But we're also human beings living in a society. So take the example of, there's a mosque in Cape Town, around the corner from me, who objected to a restaurant that was going to open up and sell liquor on Baden-Craft Street. And the blogosphere, or the internet, or the Twitter sphere at least went berserk about this, saying, you know, it's a secular society, how can we allow this mosque to block the opening of this restaurant that serves liquor? And myself, who's regularly offended lots of people by telling them their gods don't exist, said, no, hold on, that's wrong. You don't need a bottle store there. You've got one across the road. There's really no reason to cause a huge fight, because whether you think they're wrong or they're right, including they're wrong about this, Hezbollah and all that stuff, obviously they're wrong, but at the same time you're needlessly pissing them off because you don't want to cross the street to buy a beer. You're just being an arsehole, is really the point there. If they are circumcising their kids, sure, fight about that. If they're beheading people, sure, fight about that. But not because they don't want you to open a bar next to a restaurant. Sorry, open a bar next to a mosque. We must pick our battles. Strategic choices are really important. Because the key issue of how to end religion, I mean, I'm not sure if you've gotten onto this yet, but that's been solved. Okay? Ending religion has been solved already. Make people rich, and they stop believing. Look at any well-off country, look at the kind of Scandinavian areas, etc., where people don't have to worry about an afterlife, where they can care for their families and all that sort of stuff. They don't care about God anymore. God is your escape ticket from a miserable life. So if you want to be good secularists, or if you want to end religion, spend your time fighting poverty. And that's the way to do it. Or spend your time in education. You know, these are the things to spend our time and energy on. So that's one potential strategy. So we should, in a sense, disband all this stuff and go into NGO work, education, poverty relief, etc. Secondly, remember that most of the time, what are called what at least recently have been called census Christians, agree with us on those things. And there's a lovely, that's a Richard Dawkins Foundation survey last year, where he took all the people who self-identified as Christians in the previous UK census and asked them various questions about what they believe. Do you take your guidance, your moral guidance from the Bible? No, almost all of them. When else have you been to church? Well, once in the last year, kind of thing. So even the self-identified Christians, at least in civilized modern democracies, etc., don't believe in the weird stuff anymore. Okay, it's a club, it's a cultural engagement, it's a society, it's like being a Man United fan, except it's not Fergie, it's God. So my point is that caricature of the opposition, firstly, should recognize that the opposition don't look like we think they do anymore. No. Somebody's listening. That's it, actually my laptop, so it's not the projector. It's about to respond to that in a very irrational way. So caricature shouldn't be our game, first because the opposition don't look like we think they do, to some extent. And secondly, it doesn't serve our political goals, I think, to indulge in the same sorts of stereotypes that we don't like them engaging in about us. Okay, let's deal with people as they are, not how we'd like them to be. Secondly, we shouldn't have to engage in false choices. I mean, you wouldn't, well, you might believe it because you might know these people yourselves, but it's typically the case that young atheists who come and talk to me want to go out there and fight some sort of battle. You imagine them rushing into battle, screaming like berserkers with blasphemous signs or something like that. And I say, well, look, you don't have to do that, So there's room for various strategies in this battle. Some of us, I think, need to be obnoxious, sure, but not all of us. Because some of you will capture people's attention and change their minds through being abusive, sure. I think in general you won't, but some of you might. Some of us might get more value or more benefit or more effect by being a bit more, by being a bit more willing to talk. Sorry, I'm not distracted by Max, who don't do what I wanted to do. Okay. So, when I'm talking about some bigger questions than what we typically engage with. Chris Stedman's recent book, Faithiest, he asks the question, do we simply want to eradicate religion or do we want to change the world? Eradicating religion is one way of changing the world, yes. But it's perhaps not the most efficient way. Attacking it directly is perhaps not always the most efficient way of getting there. Secondly, and especially for a student society, a key question, do we always want to be right, even if it gets in the way of being wrong? Now what I mean by that is that as skeptics, as secularists, we should care most about being wrong. Because every time you're wrong, you get to learn something. And we forget about that. We instead focus on being right. So we do things like play fallacy bingo. People we say, no, you're wrong because you committed that fallacy, or that fallacy. Oh, look, your response commits that fallacy. So yes, fun, great fun, I used to do it myself, but it doesn't persuade them of anything, it doesn't teach them anything. Do we want to always be reactively coping with these rifts and madnesses and fights internally, or do we want to chart some sort of path out of it, where we build a sustainable secular movement that doesn't have these needless squabbles? And what I'd like to see a student society do is to show in practice that this reason and rationality thing actually works. That we can comment in things like Varsity, in things like the Monday paper, about tests on Saturdays, which are going to come up again very soon. So when the Jewish Student Society say we can't do this because it's a holy day, you can say, well, people get exemptions from this all the time. And you're at a secular university. You can do it in a way that persuades rather than simply offends. UCT's sphere of influence is very unpredictable. We have lots of children of cabinet ministers at UCT, and of diplomats and so forth. You don't realize, perhaps sometimes you don't realize, that the person you're talking to could be the son or daughter of somebody really important. Okay, so the signals we send out as a UCT campus can actually be quite valuable, can be quite important. Thirdly, you can grow a network of universities across the country. The SRCs, the National Network of SRCs, sits on HESA, the Higher Education Board of South Africa. And you influence government policy, at least you do in a representative sort of way. So once you get your act together and ally with Stellenbosch locally at the start and later on nationally, you can actually start making quite an impact. You can do fun things like national and regional conferences. But my point is that we're going to make little progress unless we stop with this unrelenting smugness. I don't think people like to be misinformed. Atheists often have this view that people are somehow dogmatically irrational. They believe in what they're saying. Okay, obviously they're wrong, yes. But do you think people willingly believe false things? But they know that they're false, and yet carry on believing them? No, they don't know that they're false. So the way to stop that, the way to fix that, is to persuade them that they're wrong. Which you don't do by just whacking them over the head with your logic stick. So, on a personal level, I say first decide what you are. As I said to you earlier on, science is agnostic towards the untestable things. Okay, that's a good thing. It's a good thing because that allows us to learn when we're wrong and discover things to be probably correct through falsification and all that sort of thing. We shouldn't hold opinions regarding the untestable from a skeptical viewpoint. That's a philosophical question, as I said earlier on. If we can't test things, we can't know. Because there's a word for assuming authority for non-scientific beliefs, for assuming that things cannot exist because they sound weird to you. Okay, and that's pseudoscience, just in reverse. It's the same thing we complain about a lot of the time. Being dogmatic about something that can't be proven. So me, personally, I think I'm a skeptic, I think I'm a humanist, I think I'm an atheist. Maybe you're all three of those things as well. But some of you, I would argue, are one of those things, or two of those things. And that's absolutely fine. I'm not saying that's bad. But I'm saying that recognizing which of those things you are informs your strategy. Because if you're a skeptic, then you can perhaps do a lot more good focusing on that than just being obnoxious towards religious believers. If you want to be an atheist, then focus on that. You might not spend the time researching conspiracy theories and such that a skeptic might do. Each of them is a specialization. So as I say, first find out what you're best at. Second, I would say strategically we should pay more attention to the idea that we can wait things out sometimes. Bombarding people with the facts rather than bombarding them with abuse. Letting those facts percolate, persuading people in the long run that they're wrong, I think can provide some effect that abuse can't. And as I say, we sometimes seem to think that I give you a valid deductive argument and either you accept my conclusion or your head explodes. That's, I think, sometimes how we like to treat arguments. And of course, that's not the case. And recent data is showing us that people tend to strengthen their bizarre views if you attack them head on like that. And I'm not sure if you're aware of that either. But attacking people head on about their strange beliefs in some cases tends to reinforce those strange beliefs. Because people don't like to be threatened. And yeah, I mean, here's various ways to get hold of me. I'd like to, as a concluding remark, to urge you all to get involved in whatever way, once you figure out who you are and what your strategy is. I'm sure Rob and Steph and everyone involved in the society will set up some sort of web presence for contributions, columns, and so forth. There's lots of campaigning you can do either on campus or off. Watching the news, people don't realize how important this is. Just alerting everybody else to what's going on and what sorts of issues we can protest about and combat, especially in the pseudoscience and quackery sort of arena. And yeah, thanks, that's all I wanted to tell you. Yeah.
Guys, there's also wine and juice.
So it's very hot in there.
So, question. I'd like to ask everyone in this room, by gathering within this room, we ourselves are forming a form of religion. Is that our aim? Do we also want to form a religion of people with a common belief? Because that's what religion basically is. It's based on a set of values that are filtered with lies to bring answers to current questions. Is that what we're trying to do?
You're asking the people in the room, I don't think that's an efficient way of going about it, because we don't have a big tutorial session here. I mean, so I'll give an answer, and anybody else who wants to can perhaps respond to you over a glass of wine later. But I think that's using the word religion in quite an opportunistic sort of way. Last year I was at a conference, an atheist conference, where 4,000 of us gathered and spoke about these sorts of things. And that got that accusation quite often, that this was another form of religion, like we were being in church or something like that. lots of people gather in the same space all the time, okay, at sporting events, at churches, sure, in lecture halls. So some kind of common interest allows you to A, learn from each other, get insights and so forth from each other, and secondly, you get comfort and support. We're living in a country, this one here, where approximately 80% of people identify as religious, specifically Christian. So in an environment like that, especially the 19-year-olds who are mostly in my classroom, go home to environments where if they told their father or mother they were atheists, they'd get shouted at, they might get thrown out of the house. So in that sort of context, gathering with, even in this case, 30 people, never mind 4,000, is comforting. It says, I'm not alone. So as I say, there's the logical aspect, which is what atheism often focuses on, but there is a genuine human aspect to life. There is a psychological reality of things, too.
As a last comment, I could then say that we are going through a religious evolution. We tend to shift from one belief to the next, which is something that has been going on for as long as we've been able to think properly.
You could, but then the word religion seems to mean whatever you'd like it to be. Go ahead, it's fine. Doesn't matter. We are changing our minds all the time, and that's a good thing. Yeah.
I don't know if you have any comment about this, but you use the words reason and rationality and so a lot. And I must say that I like the idea of a secular society, and I like the idea of an opportunity to discuss things, but I feel that the human being is an emotional being, and that these things are interesting to discuss too. And I would just like to say this, that I think that from my point of view, I'm very interested in this, but that does not mean that I'm classifying a human being as a totally logical machine and all other aspects of human existence we're not going to discuss. We are going to discuss.
Yeah, certainly. Certainly. I mean, any worldview that denies that would be a little bit crazy. I mean, I'm a logician, so apologies, but that's how I talk.
You spoke a little bit about contribution that religion offers towards communities, sort of community engagement in a way. And I've often thought about this because when you go to communities where religion is often, it's almost like a parental figure for the entire community, it offers a lot of support that is far more accessible than any kind of emotional support that you have in secular societies. If you have an emotional problem, it's easier to go to, you know, the group of people with whom you congregate than it is to go to a therapist. There's less stigma attached. And there's no secular, well, as far as I know, there's no secular equivalent of that kind of support. And for me, I feel like that's an important human need that secularism struggles to address. Do you have any thoughts on how that could be?
Very good, yeah, very good observation. So just to briefly punt my Wednesday column in the Maverick this week is related to that, because for a long time we've been, in economics primarily this observation was since observed, we've been focusing on hypothetical humans rather than real ones. Okay, so my logic comment refers as well. Real human beings, rather than these ones we'd love human beings to be, do need that. They do seem to want some sort of mythology, some sort of broader meaning, some sort of metaphysical significance. Okay? In time, perhaps we'll persuade them that they're wrong, but for now, that's who they are. So if we want to persuade real humans rather than hypothetical humans, we've got to tap into that somehow. Okay, so two ways of doing it. And the one is, in terms of the more nebulous faith-based sort of activities and congregations and so forth, they've got a lock, the religious people have got a lock on these quite seductive environments where you can sell your message. Okay, so some sort of weekly gathering or whatever it might be. We've got things like Skeptics in the Pub, okay, which we have one of those in Cape Town every month. More of that sort of thing would be a good thing. So people can get that kind of support I was talking about to you earlier on. People can get that kind of comfort and support. But secondly, in terms of things like charities, disaster relief, all of those sorts of things, I think 2 of the 3 most charitable Americans are atheists. They don't make a big deal of it. Okay, but Buffett and Gates aren't believers. But if something bad happens and there was a UCT Student FSI at Habitat for Humanity, with their banner, not making a big deal of it. They're not attacking believers, but just there doing something. Then the next time somebody says atheists never do anything good, you can say, no, that's just not true. Okay? The public perception, the PR battle needs to be played a bit more carefully. They're right.
Jacques, I kind of feel that but this may just be my own perception, my own bias, but I slightly feel you missed the point of that question. Feel free to tell me that I'm wrong. And I think it ties into what you were saying also, that in my perception, the value of attending that kind of ritual, whether it's Christian or whether it's fundamentalist or liberal, whether it's whatever religion, is not so much about receiving a notion or about spreading a notion. It's about a kind of emotional therapy, you could say, that comes from a very permissive, open-hearted, emotional space that people partake in. That's why I think it connects with the emotion aspect. And I feel that your response focuses on the fact that people are going there to receive an emotion or a message. And that perhaps there is a need, which hasn't actually been acknowledged yet, for that kind of space to be inhabited. And saying that these humans are not as we'd like them to be, or that they're wrong, is actually to miss the point, I think. That this is the way that humans are, or seem to be, and those needs are quite valid and should be met.
I see where you're coming from. I disagree on the nature of humans in a normative way. I mean, I agree that we are those beings contingently right now. So I would soften what I said earlier on to say that yes, but I would still be doing it as a game. I'd still be doing it as a strategy rather than as something which taps into a proto-human or an actual extent human. I think you're wrong with that. But there's empirical data about that which will come out in the wash. In the meanwhile, your strategy or mine are probably going to roughly coincide much in time. But yeah, no, I do get your point.
Hi, I'm not admit to meet this, but I saw your poster. I thought it was cool. I just have a question. Okay, I get the whole skepticism thing. That's great. It's a good idea because you don't want false things being perpetuated in society, and you don't want that happening. Okay, I get humanism because people are good. Yay. But could you explain why you were encouraging us to try? Because like sitting here, it sounded like you were saying we should try and convert the belief